I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are excited to kick off a new series that does a deep dive into a unique cybersecurity concern, and that is insider threats. In my view, insider threats is one of the most challenging cybersecurity issues that companies face today, in part because it's not just a cybersecurity concern. It really touches on so many functional areas within our clients' organizations and triggers legal considerations that require a multidisciplinary team approach. So over the course of this episode and future episodes, we'll have a number of our colleagues across Hogan Lovells come together to discuss key aspects of insider threat investigations. Everything from privacy to cybersecurity to employment and IP and the many other issues that are triggered in the United States and around the world. So stay tuned for those future episodes. But today I wanted to start really at the beginning and lay a foundation for how we can start to think about insider threats and how they present within our clients' organizations and how to start preparing for that. So I'm very excited to be joined by two of my partners, Stephanie Yonekura in our LA office and Pete Marta in our New York office. And Stephanie and Pete, I asked you both to join because you bring both unique and deep perspectives on insider threat cases in your practices. Stephanie, you head our investigations, white collar and fraud practice. Pete, you're a member of our cybersecurity practice and focus on incident response, among other things. And so each of you have dealt with insider cases in your practice for both from different perspectives. Really welcome you to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. So Stephanie, maybe I can ask you to get us kickstarted on this conversation, maybe with asking the very broad question of what is an insider threat and why is it causing so much concern among our clients?
Sure, Scott. So an insider threat is actually the potential for someone to use their either authorized access or special knowledge of an organization in a way that jeopardizes the integrity, confidentiality, running of the organization all the way around. It can take just so many forms. It can be someone who does it negligently by mistake, or it can be someone that does it intentionally, or even taking it to the further extreme, maliciously. So it can affect the organization's data, their facilities, anything to do with their business all the way around. But it just, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it just takes so many different forms.
That's a really interesting point, and just in terms of how varied this looks. And maybe, Pete, I'd ask you from your perspective on this, because I know if I'm working with you for a number of years that you are in the trenches working against threat actors, against bad guys all day long. Insider threats actually kind of as a different type of threat. And, what makes that unique from your perspective?
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. That's a great question. I think insider threats are unique in a number of ways. In my experience, establishing and operating a true insider threat program can really be a challenging effort. And conversations that often take place during the planning stages can often come down to, for example, what kind of company do we want to be? What type of culture do we want to have? How would this plan be viewed globally, right? Not just in the US, for example. And then, what do regulators expect of us? And so these initiatives often involve inputs from numerous stakeholders across an organization. So legal plays a key role, of course, but other representatives often include human resources, the chief security officer's organization, and what a lot of companies would call employee relations or something to that effect, really the department that focuses on culture and employee experience. And perhaps not surprisingly, these groups can have widely divergent perspectives on whether the company should have an insider threat program, whether or not having one is appropriate, how it should be scoped, and what it should encompass. And so I'd say, in addition, insider threats bring a human component to an investigation that you often don't see in other types of incidents. So, for example, upon the detection of a possible insider, one step an organization will likely want to consider is increased monitoring of the individual or individuals who are allegedly involved. And that can include monitoring of email, internet browsing, printing, badge swipes, stuff like that. And so from a legal perspective, that can be challenging because, as you know, the laws differ by jurisdiction, sometimes significantly, around things like employee monitoring.
I really want to tease that out a little bit more, Pete, because when we're talking about the effort that is needed to stand up an insider threat program and the number of stakeholders that are needed to bring to the table for that program to operate effectively, I think one of the reasons why is that a insider threat is different than an external threat. Because the insider, right, has been given some level of trust to this information and is misusing that trust in comparison to external parties, which we never trusted to begin with. So I'm interested in your perspective on that dynamic, because when we are together in the trenches fighting cybercrime, it's very different to fight somebody who is a threat actor criminal from Eastern Europe or from another country versus somebody who you presumably hired and trusted with your information.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And of course, we should also point out that in some cases, an investigation can start out with the perspective that this is an external actor that we're dealing with. And then later on, in some cases, this has happened, you learn that there's an insider component to it. And that certainly poses unique challenges. I think one of which is, and this is very much Stephanie's world, is determining how to appropriately scope the investigation, who is aware of the investigation, who needs to know if you have a potential insider, how to deal with identifying that individual or individuals and determining what steps to take. And as I said a minute ago, initially that could be just increased monitoring of the employee or employees, or in some cases, it's going to include an investigation of the employee, and that poses really unique challenges.
Well, Pete, I would even take it back one step, because you were just talking about the fact that your insider threat plan can affect culture, or culture can affect your insider threat plan. And so what are you going to monitor? What are you going to tell the employees that you're monitoring? And so what are you looking for? Are you looking for hours of access? What types of information that they're looking at? And do you share that or not? There are two schools of thought on that, right? It could encourage good behavior, or it could encourage people to try and find other ways to work around what you've already told them about. But you're also totally right with respect to an investigation. If you get to a point where you're investigating, then that is where it's really important to involve legal. This is an interesting realm, right? We have all of the IT specialists and system specialists out there that companies safe on a daily basis. And then all of a sudden, you're throwing lawyers into the mix. So just like you were saying, lawyers should already be part of your plan to know when to bring them in. And you bring them in for an internal investigation because you want to do your best to try and keep that investigation privileged as long as you can while you assess the situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as you said, there are different schools of thought here. But when you're dealing with a large global organization like we often are, the laws differ significantly over whether or not you can conduct certain monitoring and by what means, for what purpose, whether you need to provide notice of the monitoring, whether you need to, in some jurisdictions, obtain consent, and then whether consent is deemed voluntary in the workplace. The answers to all of those differ by jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Yeah. And I think one of the examples that we're all talking about here really focus on employee threats, right? And that is very much a classic example where you have an employee who is misusing information, providing information to third parties. Stephanie, from your perspective, are there other ways that this presents where it's not necessarily one employee acting herself or himself?
The employee perspective can take different forms, right? So it can be the employee acting by themselves. It could be what's in the industry called collusion, where cyber criminals are colluding or agreeing or partnering with that employee to create some kind of cybersecurity breach on a company. So that then takes several forms. Again, we're talking about how many different branches there are when you take a look at insider threats. But with this particular one, they can be trying to just commit fraud, espionage, sabotage, violence. It can take all kinds of forms. So that's where an employee could come in. But as you're trying to address this amorphous issue from every angle, contractors or vendors, right? There's been lots of cybersecurity breaches that happen because a contractor or vendor was breached. That would be a negligent one, right? That's not even where that contractor or vendor is trying to wreak havoc on their own. But you have contractors, vendors, anyone with actually specialized knowledge of your business systems goals can be the source of an insider threat.
Yeah. And you're making the point, which I think is the right one, is that could be both intentional, unintentional. It could be fraudulent. It could be with the best intents in mind. And Pete, when Stephanie was describing that, an example that I think you and I have seen often is that clients ask to do dark web searches and they see that potentially credentials into their systems are being offered for sale. And difficult to understand how those credentials were out there, who has purchased them, how they're being used. But you want to talk a little bit about that as being an example where it could be an insider threat where an individual is actively selling her or his information, or it could be the negligent kind that person wrote their credentials on a Post-it note and then left it in the subway. So Pete, I want to maybe then pivot back to something you mentioned right at the start, because you were talking about the multidisciplinary team, the cross-functional practice areas that are needed to come together for this. I think you mentioned the CISO, HR, legal, compliance. I guess maybe my question is, how do you think of insider threats? Is it a privacy issue? Is it a cybersecurity issue, an employment issue? In your mind, how are you bucketing that? And how are you thinking about what expertise is needed to effectively respond?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it really is similar to cybersecurity more generally. Whereas if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, it wouldn't be uncommon to have folks offer the perspective that cybersecurity is just an IT issue and why are lawyers poking around. And today, I think there's pretty widespread agreement that cybersecurity is first and foremost, a risk issue. It's a board level issue. Lawyers certainly need to be involved. And that really goes to who does your overall team need to be and the importance of understanding that ahead of time. It's a multidisciplinary effort. In my view, though, with legal playing the role of quarterback, or if you don't like that American analogy, maybe conductor or something like that. But I would say that the insider threat is really all of the above. It's a privacy issue. There is a cyber part to it, and then other. Insider threats, may or may not have a cyber nexus, but most implicate privacy issues as well as employment law considerations. And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, the laws around things like employee monitoring and conducting investigations vary by jurisdiction. From a cyber perspective, most organizations' weakest link, their biggest risk is their workforce. And usually you're not talking about malicious employees or contractors, though that does happen, but you're really more often talking about lazy, careless, or otherwise negligent members of the workforce. And I think despite certainly increased efforts to train and test workforce members on things like cybersecurity hygiene and best practices, a decent percentage are still going to click on the link in that phishing email or fall for what have become increasingly sophisticated social engineering schemes. And I think this is going to be increasingly challenging in the future, with things like deepfakes and other AI-enabled cyber scams. So again, I would say it's all of the above.
Yeah. And Stephanie, from your perspective, what are we protecting against here? What are the risks that organizations need to be thinking about when they are saying, how do I prepare myself against an insider threat or maybe experience an insider threat? What are the ways that risks or harms are actually presenting to companies in practice?
It can come in all forms again. I mean, I think the best practice is to focus on your crown jewels, right? What is the information that is most important to the organization? And then protect around that. Because, in answer to your question, it is espionage, sabotage, outright theft. At a different extreme, there's violent internal threats that can take the form of just workplace violence or even to the extreme of terrorism. But really, it's mostly looking at your crown jewels and protecting those crown jewels. And then the cybersecurity is the umbrella over all of it, because an insider threat can be non-technology related. But in this day and age, more and more, just like Pete said, with respect to all of the ways that people can get into your system and utilizing weak links of different people who aren't being vigilant about their cybersecurity know-how, that's where it comes into play.
Yeah. So in other words, is if I'm hearing you right, there's many risks and many harms that may create. And then you start kind of from the very beginning and saying, where is your crown jewels, right? Where is your either most valuable intellectual property, your most sensitive data sets, where we'd say that have a lot of value. And then importantly, what types of data actually carries the most amount of risk? You know, your HRIS system, your consumer databases, all of those things that the loss of which could result in significant legal exposure and the disruption to your business. Because Pete, an example of maybe an insider threat that I know you deal a lot with is when somebody clicks on a phishing email and all of a sudden that results in an eventual ransomware compromise, in which case we're not necessarily talking about loss of data. We're talking about actually having the ability of operating your business.
Exactly. And with ransomware, that increasingly is both an operational issue where traditional ransomware, a threat actor has usually, to your point, leveraged a phishing campaign, achieved some degree of success and drop malware on the system. So there's an operational impact. But it's also the idea that in many cases, the threat actor is, before dropping the malware, identifying the most sensitive information, exfiltrating it, and then dropping the malware. And that's, the concept of double extortion, where now the threat actor has 2 points of pressure to convince a company to pay. It has locked up systems with the malware, but it's also stolen potentially very sensitive information. And that could be information not just of valuable to the company's operations, but even in cases where maybe a company isn't consumer facing, almost every organization has sensitive information of its employees. And we've seen a number of cases where an organization has made the decision, the very difficult decision, that even without operational impact, it's probably the right thing to do, or it's the right decision to pay a ransom to protect the sensitive information of their employees.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm interested in both of your experiences in this area, because I think we've mentioned several types of ways that insider threats present. Everything from negligence, where somebody's clicking on a phishing email. Pete, you were talking about ransomware and data breaches and data exfiltration as another example. Stephanie, I'm interested in your perspective, kind of other examples that you've heard about or that you've worked on that come to mind about how these issues are actually coming to bear.
Sure. I used to be a prosecutor. I was at DOJ for almost 15 years. So I'll go to the criminal angles of all of this. It can be the disclosure of classified data, intentional. You take at the extreme of the Edward Snowdens of the world, who are taking national security secrets and sharing it with foreign governments. But the extra layer of insanity in my mind in this realm that I used to deal with more in my former life is just nation states or national security issues where foreign governments are actually the ones who you are protecting against. And I know that when we were talking about insider threat, a nation state would be more external unless there's that collusion that we talked about. But it is taking the motives behind insider threats are just so varied that you're having to look at all these types of motives and looking at risk factors. Has someone been fired? Does someone need money? And then are they vulnerable to these collusion agreements or collusion relationships with even maybe a nation state who's trying to infiltrate a company.
Yeah. Pete, interested in your perspective.
Yeah.
Your examples come to mind?
Yeah. So I'll draw on my past life as well and build on what Stephanie just mentioned. I think the area of, you could call it espionage or maybe counterintelligence risk, is a particular one that I'm familiar with. And I think that the true level of CI risk, again, or counterintelligence risk facing organizations today varies a lot, and it varies by industry, size, geographic footprint, and I think in other ways. For some global organizations, it is a near certainty that they have been or currently are, or at least were in the past, penetrated by a foreign intelligence service. And by that, I mean the organization's employees or contractors or even executives have been approached by a foreign intelligence service seeking to obtain information and insights into the company, into prominent individuals inside the company, into plans and intentions of the company. In other cases, we've seen individuals, the Foreign Intelligence Service will even direct an individual under its control to apply for and obtain employment at a target organization. So it happens both ways. And in that case, they're compromised, so to speak, day one of their employment.
And I'm sure when they are hired, they fully disclose the fact that they are working on behalf of a foreign government and wear their hat saying, I'm working on behalf of this government.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, because the insider threat program at my former employer in the intelligence community was a periodic polygraph exam. And that was part of the controls that were built in for the system to work. And of course, you can't do that in the private sector. So different challenges and different ways to meet them.
Yeah. Well, interested in maybe both of your perspectives on one final question. And that is, Pete, I think you had made the point earlier in the conversation that sometimes it's hard to know where the threat actor is, who the threat actor is, whether this is an insider threat, whether this is, a traditional threat, or whether this is just noise and nothing at all. What are some things that you're looking out for where you say, hey, this strikes me as a risk for an insider threat? Interested in both of your views on that.
Yeah, I think in my experience, insider threats are detected in different ways, and in some ways depends on the type of threat you're talking about. So in some cases, insider threats can be identified by other employees. One particular example was a client where the individual's coworkers reported a concerning sudden change in behavior, wide mood swings, inappropriate comments, and even violence. And they were concerned about, really workplace violence. And so that was just coworkers, other employees identifying a potential threat. Other cases, an internal investigation determines that there's an insider. For example, the investigation could conclude that an individual or group has conspired to commit fraud against the organization. And I guess going back to CI risk, we've also seen other situations where law enforcement, in the US, it's often the FBI, will actually inform a company that it may have an insider threat situation. And the organization learns about it for the first time from law enforcement. So I think that these can be identified in a number of different ways.
And Stephanie, I know in your practice as kind of leading our fraud and internal investigations team, insider threats is only one of many different types of cases that you handle. And obviously, many of the cases that you work on involve different types of concerns that may be triggered by employee action. Kind of from your perspective, you start hearing a client say, hey, I see something suspicious. What in your mind says, hey, this may be insider threat versus an external threat?
We look at who has access to that system that had what looks to be suspicious. Have they had some type of negative employment interaction, either with their bosses or even being disciplined? That happens quite a lot. Terminated employees, although I still think that would be an insider threat because they're still using their access. If somehow a company forgets to turn off their access, which we would say stay vigilant about that. I've seen many cases where a terminated employee comes back and accesses the system for sabotage, for purely to mess up the system and wreak havoc, or for fraud and theft. So you're looking at the outliers when you're trying to figure out what happened in internal investigation. And sometimes, just like what Pete's talking about, the best information are the human sources of information who can kind of tell you what's what with some of the players that have been playing in that sandbox.
Yeah, I think that point is right on from my experience, because us humans, we're rather messy, and insider threats issues are inherently human because they're driven by any number of incentives, right? The terminated employee, classic example. And multiple times I've worked with clients who their former employees are logging in using credentials to wreak havoc just purely for revenge and spite. Nothing that is a financial gain, just looking to finally take revenge back on their former employer. So I think that's exactly right. Well, with that, I really want to thank both of you for joining the podcast and really starting this conversation, which I'm so excited to continue with other members of the Hogan Lovells team, including a number of the partners who work within your practice, Stephanie, and a number of our colleagues in the privacy and cybersecurity practice, Pete. I think it's going to be a great series, and hopefully you'll be willing to come back on a future podcast to continue this conversation. So with that, I'm super excited to announce that we'll have a second episode coming shortly that will discuss how to start an insider threat investigation. Really looking forward to that episode. I think you will too. I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those are your data points.